Hi, everyone. My name is, I guess we'll get started. My name is Sean Lennon. I'm a full professor here at VSU, professor of education. And today I'd like to talk to you about controversy and controversial issues, or more specifically, controversial issues and how discussing them can help you with critical and empathetic thinking. I teach in the Department of Teacher Education. I'm an old social studies teacher, but for many, many years, I taught critical thinking, empathetic thinking, and I've taught controversial issues. And I'm here to tell you that this isn't necessarily just for teachers. These are skill sets that most of us can apply and use today. So we'll see if we can apply them and talk to them a little bit on this stage. Controversial issues from an educational standpoint is that we have to teach this, especially in certain content areas, social studies. We also have to teach controversial issues to avoid them. And as teachers, sometimes politicking, all that kind of stuff, you might fall yourself into a controversy. However, sometimes controversy can elicit some great thinking. Sometimes controversy can elicit some really good feedback and really good learning. And so using skill sets that we use for teachers, maybe we can apply them into other roads of life. Okay? So before we get started, let's talk a little bit about controversial issues. And what makes something controversial? Well, here today to tell you just about everything's controversial. Everything can be controversial in some shape, way, or form. And in fact, if it's not controversial, that probably itself is controversial. It's probably going to be that way. Basically, it's an issue or idea, news, construct, any type of concept that doesn't fall within the normative values and defined expectations of a group. Okay, that's all it is. And we can have different groups. You can have groups family, you can have groups of a church, you can have groups of a school, a class, all this stuff. So you have to think of groups being layered. Okay, so in each different layer of groups, there could be something that's outside the expected norm of that group. Fair enough. But you have to think, how many groups are you associated with? And in sociology, we know this to usually be around 50 to 100 different groups that you can work professionally, socially, and all this kind of stuff. And it could be less or more, but these are layered groups. And obviously something that doesn't fit in the norm, but it also maybe bring up an emotional layer as well. And this is where a lot of times in teacher ed, we try to say, well, if we're going to teach controversial issues, a little bit of emotion might be good, but maybe we'll start with the lower emotions first, but you can work your way up into these. Technically, it's probably best to start slow and work up, but a little bit of emotion does the body good. It really will. However, for today, we're not going to really do a whole lot of highly charged stuff. We're going to talk about maybe some lower charged, and we use this term, high charged and low charged type of controversial issues. So if I want to elicit an emotive kind of response from my students, I can still do it, but maybe not to the point where they're throwing sticks and stones at me. So we might want to get there a little bit, how we get to it and everything else like that. So let's focus on that, not too highly charged, and something that may not fit in the grand scheme of things. Also, it's good for the soul if you kind of come to grips with the idea that it doesn't have to be resolved. One of the issues that we have in our society today, and it doesn't really behoove it very well to a democratic system, is that we don't have to resolve every issue. And in fact, some issues are best not to be resolved. Sometimes somebody can be on one side of the aisle, sometimes somebody can be on the other side of the aisle, and that's fine. So as we talk about controversy, some of the constructs that we talk about is just something outside the medium norm of a group, depending on what groups it is, that can have an emotive level, some higher or lower. At the same time, it may not necessarily be resolvable. And in fact, as a teacher years ago, I used to give my kids an unsolvable riddle as an assignment. Many, many years ago, when I was still teaching social studies, I would tell my students for a solid A, if they could take care of the Middle East peace process, I would give them an A. And I'd tell them it's simple. It's just you got Israel, you got Palestine, and about 180 other countries that don't like it. And the kids would get involved, and they give me an idea, and I said, doesn't work or even try, doesn't work or even, and they would get so frustrated. But there's learning in that frustration, because what do you think everybody else has gone over for the last 50 years? It's frustration. It could be an unresolvable issue, or at least unresolvable with the ethics and morality that we're willing to do. Other ideas of that are outside the pale of the norm. So basically, going back to controversial issues, it's anything that does not have a near universal agreement that we fall over from all involved, in which basically, for all intents and purposes, means controversial issues very normal. You guys will be dealing with controversy every day, all your lives. Okay? And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you run away from. It doesn't have to be something that you can avoid. It could be something that you embrace very, very well. And in fact, you can almost say controversy is almost as normal as non-controversy. So if we get into this kind of concept, then the idea is you really should be at home dealing with controversial issues and should not be afraid. You should be applicable to dealing with it. It doesn't necessarily mean you got to jump in there like a bouncer in an established area, but and speak your mind. But it's something where the idea that controversy and people with different views is as normal as it can be. And to discuss this a little bit, I always like using probability scales and statistics. And it's very simple. This is what we call the bell curve. And this is what we use as a standard deviation. And basically, I think the idea of every population is going to have certain adherence to the far left, certain adherence to the far right, with the bulk of the population in the middle. And the first stanine, or what we're going to call standard deviation, is usually about 70% of the population. The second stanine, or deviation, will usually encompass about the next 90. So if you're looking at this and we're doing with a controversial issue, you have an issue and you reside somewhere to the right of it, or you reside somewhere to the left. That's great. You're in the standard deviation. You're in the normal grouping of people who agree with this. However, that is if this is a standard skew. Very times it might go this way, or it might go down this way. And if you're to the left or to the right, you're going to find yourself outside that deviation. Lo and behold, you think you're a normal person, everything's fine, you've got no controversy. Well, guess what? Controversies come to you. By pure chance or by just happenstance of life, something that you agree or something that you think of is going to fall outside that standard norm. It's going to happen, which means you might as well be assuming that some view that you have will be controversial to someone else. Okay. So maybe discussing controversial issues can be beneficial. We do it all the time, or we avoid it all the time. So I'm here today to say maybe it's something that we should stop avoiding, and maybe it's something we should stop yelling. Maybe it would be good for all of us if we embrace ones with difference. Okay, so the next part about this is critical thinking. And this is where education can come on in a little bit, because critical thinking is a very, very ephemeral term. Depending upon your discipline and depending upon some aspects of higher thinking, it could depend upon just about anything you want. Sociology, critical thinking is seen in anything that's above rote memorization. Psychology, anything above rote memorization is considered metacognitive critical thinking. Neurological sciences, anything with certain brain waves or anything like this. So it gets really ephemeral. However, in education, we like to break it down a little bit more, and I'll give you mine. Critical thinking, my definition is, and this is a little bit long, but anything that has to take your sense of who you are, any new knowledge, any new piece, and you have to tilt your perspective, and I'm probably going to fall over trying to do this, you have to tilt your perspective to accept that knowledge. We call that a schema. And so I'm bringing something in, it could be some of these wonderful lectures that we had today, talking about Jim Crow or something like this, and something, wow, didn't know that. Could that have been applied? And so you have to tilt, I'm a Caucasian male. So can I be somewhat at fault, responsible, however? And so you have to accept that. And when you accept that and you come to grips with it, you have two choices. One, you take it in, you revert yourself back down, and now you're no longer leading, you're no longer precarious, and you've learned something, and you're forever changed. You will forever see things through the life of those different schemas and that different type of information. Or you can reject it outright. Okay, so critical thinking is the idea of taking new knowledge, incorporating it, and becoming something new with it. And this is very common. Even something that you don't take as life-altering will change your life. This could be a fact. 2 + 2 = 4. Well, from now on, I know how to count. It'll change things. So a lot of this stuff will come to you. And this zone and this change forever is a concept of critical thinking. Now, this is obviously a very individual type of thing. And as I go down here, and you can see on here, the psychologists and cognitive scientists will argue constantly about what's critical thinking. In education, we break it down much easier. If it's not rote memorization, it's critical thinking. Okay? So if I tell you 2 + 2 = 4, great. Let's take it further. Why? At that point, we can start moving up. So the essence, the discussion, the theory, teachers were a little too pragmatic for that. We're just going to find ways to illustrate it. But I want to warn you, though, it can break down in the theoretical aspects. But as useful tools, we will do this. And the two that I'm most cognizant of and teach on the bottom of the slide is Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge. Teachers are limited by using these, but you're not. Okay, you can use a lot of different kind of aspects and everything. However, what works for teachers tends to usually help. But like I said, as an addendum, they're not always perfect. Bloom's taxonomy was created in 1956 by Dr. Bloom, and it's the idea like a pyramid, everything has a stepping point to the next level. So the very bottom, and remember what I said, rote memorization, this is remember. One of the things I like to teach my students and everything is how easy rote memorization is. And a couple of you may groan on this one. And one of the most simplest rote things is when did World War I end? And I know you're going to look like, oh, Lord, he's going to talk about this. Well, World War I ended on the 11th hour of the 11th minute of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. Okay? 11, 11, 11, 11, 11. Simple, simple peasy. All right? Now, I just gave you a date. 11, 11, 11, 11. Let's work our way up to it. Understand, why do we do that? Well, we had to do that quite simply because in the trenches, we're very limited, no such thing as radio, and the phones didn't work. It took 2, 3, 4 weeks for this information to come down. So we declared that the date would be 4 weeks in the future. Keep shooting until that date comes in and the guns go silent. Wow, okay. Can we apply this knowledge? Sure. Why was it so difficult? Dead man zones, people cutting things, basically just no way of getting a hold of anything. Could you make it easier? Could you have done better? Analyze the situation. How many deaths occurred in those 3 to 4 weeks that could have been avoided? Evaluate the carnage. Maybe create a new plan. So as each step as we go up, technically it could be a higher sense of critical thinking. Though this is, like I said, a pragmatic tool. In teaching, a lot of things that we ask for is just to get beyond the first step. Not really interested in you going all the way up, because sometimes you're not going to get all the way up there. And the very top tier is usually the most controversial. Different scientists, different cognition experts and stuff will say sometimes create, sometimes metacognitive, sometimes these kind of things. But they all kind of blend in a little bit. And teachers do have to follow these. The one that we're teaching a lot of teachers now is Webb's depth of knowledge. This is usually 4. And as you can tell, first one, knowledge acquisition, rote memorization. When did World War I end? 11, 11, 11. Congratulations, you got to step 1. All right? And for a lot of my students, I do 1492, and there's always a third one. I forget off the top. And at the end of the semester, all they remember is those 3 rote facts. They don't remember anything else. Why? Because it's the easiest to remember. Okay? Then take a look, knowledge application, knowledge analysis, and augmentation. So usually the top number usually involves some form of change. As a social studies teacher, I always like historical fiction. And I usually get my students to do that. And one of the things I would always ask is, what happens if George Washington had 4 horses shot out from him in the Spanish-American War? People were trying to shoot him. Had 4 horses. What would have happened if George Washington had been killed in this, the French-American War? Would we still be America today? And I would have my students write a little thing. What would have happened? And do whatever you want. Go with it. And they would really find this interesting. I give them a couple facts and all this kind of stuff, and they get into it because they could do it on their own. Okay, so a lot of times this really will appeal, even though it's a much higher level. Okay, so basically illustrating simple ways to conceptualize higher cognitive levels of thinking. So these are where these tools are really good. All right, so going back to this, I want to just do this, and this is the highest level. This is metacognitive or metacognition, and we don't do this much in teacher education, but you're going to hear this a lot in the socialized aspects and in psychology. In psychology, metacognition is any critical thinking outside rote memorization. In social constructs, metacognition is the highest level of thinking. It's thinking about thinking, and it's thinking about your place in the world. And when I say your place in the world, go back to those zones, go back to those groups. You've got one group church, one group friends, one group work, one group this, and all those groups line up. But maybe you don't realize that those groups all have expectations and ideas for you to be. You may not know it, but you're adhering to those groups. You're adhering to the societal normative standards. And in metacognition, one of these issues is, are you aware of this? Are you aware of this? I was telling my students the other day about, some of these issues of normative versus law. And, some normative opinions and stuff still go on. Like maybe people don't realize it, but in Valdosta, I'm going to nail Valdosta out, it is still illegal for 4 non-related females to rent a house in Valdosta. It's been illegal since the 1900s. And one of the issues that comes up is, if you take a look, there are no sorority houses at VSU. There's none. There's fraternities. There's no sororities. All the sororities are in the dorms. Because in Valdosta, 4 females not related, it is considered a house of ill repute. In other words, 4 females together, you must be prostitutes. It is still enforced today. It's still enforced. Now, of course, I teach education, guys, which I have 35 students in my class. Guess how many are female? 35. And they're ignoring me until I say that. And then I got the whole attention. Everybody's like, oh, no. Well, that's not a law. That's a norm. That was a norm from 100 years ago. VSU was started as a common school for female teachers. And they would start with 8 teachers that didn't even have dorms. You had to stay at a house. Okay? So just thinking about societal roles brings you to the process used to plan, monitor, and assess one's understanding. Do we understand how we work in the society? And can you analyze and control one's own process? Do you understand this? Do you understand how your thinking even works? I used to tell my students all the time, when you think of a complicated structure or complicated thing, do you do it with language or do you do it with pictures? Because if you do it with language, imagine people before language. If you didn't have language, you didn't have thinking. Now imagine somebody who's a polyglot with multiple different languages. Is there some languages that you can think better in? You know the answer is yes. Okay? So thinking about thinking is where we want everybody to get. Too bad for sometimes it's very hard. And like a muscle, it can be difficult. So what does this mean for all of you? As a professor of education, I want my students to be able to teach critical thinking through controversy. And I have them talk about it. And I have them learn to get along with each other as best as they can. Can this equate to non-students? Of course, we live in a democracy. And for any of my teachers out here, you know full well you want these students to learn and to adapt and to do this stuff. So if I'm doing it for my students who are then doing it for students, why can't we do it for everyone? Remember those Thanksgiving meals where you one that killed the uncle? Maybe it's time to talk to the uncle. Maybe not. No, I'll leave that up to you. But higher thinking processes work the brain like a muscle. When I was finishing up my dissertation, I had to do my comps. And my comps, I remember this clearly. We had 6 questions. I was there all day. I had to do it on a computer. I had all this kind of stuff. And afterwards, a group of us met at a bar. And we were thinking, and my head hurt. I was lightheaded. I felt weird for like 2 days. And everybody there was feeling weird. We had just spent 8 hours working our brain. Hadn't done that in a while. And it's interesting because when I teach kids, like, do critical thinking, they know it. They're like, oh, really? Can't we just do 2 + 2? Can't we do that? But it's good for you. The more you do it, the more you apply, the more you understand, and the more you can relate to other processes that you just don't know are running behind the scenes. It can develop empathy towards others. Remember, it's not wrong to have a different opinion. What's wrong is not to accept that different of opinion. Now, granted, if somebody says, well, I think, people should be like violently hurt or something, I guess we can avoid that one. But in general, when it comes to minor issues that involve controversy and stuff, what is controversial is not controversial to some other people, which means it's very common. It's as common as the day. Understanding correlating constructs, the different groups that come together. Remember, you're layered of groups in sociology. Do you understand what society is asking of you? With our people in here today, some of these wonderful speakers, we were talking about Jim Crow, racism, biasness, accepting of others, sexuality, all that kind of stuff. These are constant constructs that work through society and have been working through society for 1,000 years. They're not going away next year. But when people say we got a new issue, no, it's not. In 1996, my very first year of teaching, we had a young man that walked through the hallways at a very small 6'8" with tall heels. He wanted to be a girl. And he wore a dress and high heels. 6'8", the largest, scariest girl I ever saw in my life. I'm 5'5", just so you get an idea. And in 1996, he asked the principal, who didn't ask me, if he could use the restroom for the girls. Aren't we having a problem with that now? Trans kids want to use a bathroom? Guys, this was 25 years ago. Nothing changes. We just change the terms. Understanding different society and sociological concepts. Everything from expectations of females and what you should wear and dress, expectations of male, white, black, just how the society changes us and molds us and how we adapt to the society itself. And last, empathetic thinking. This is the part that I really like. Now, I make my students talk to each other. And sometimes they get a little fussy because we're not used to talking in disagreement tones. So I'll have students, and sometimes some of my students will tell you that if all the kids banding on one side, I'll do the devil's advocate. I'll go on the other side because it's not about winning the discussion. It's about understanding the discussion is possible. And then realizing, hey, when it's all done over with, you've got a different opinion than me, I got a different opinion than me. Hey, you want to go out and have a drink? I'm stuck on drinking. You want to go have a cup of coffee? Okay, you can tell I'm a teacher. You can see where that goes. So empathetic thinking. And I would argue in America, we need a lot more of this. Our political system could use quite a bit. And then as I finish off with what benefits again? And the benefits are a strong, healthy brain. For anybody that's getting older, we're all getting older, dementia, cognitive displacement, cognitive issues with age comes about. Well, guess what? You use your brain, it will help prevent that. It really will. You don't have to do anything crazy, but look at something online that's a little different or learn something in there. Believe it or not, for many of you all that are expanding your education, people with advanced degrees that continue following up with their degrees and or researching or keeping up with it tend to be an offset dementia by over 10 years. It's a life-saving, healthy activity, just like working out. All right, and then my name is Sean Lennon again, and this is my idea of controversial issues and how this can help with critical empathetic thinking. Thank you all. Have a good day.